Hello, and welcome to today's conversation. My name's Rose Jackson. I am the director of the DFR Lab's Democracy and Tech Initiative here at the Atlantic Council. We create policy practices that align global stakeholders towards tech and governance that reinforces rather than undermines open societies. I'm excited to have this conversation hosted today, China's digital strategy at home and abroad, because so much of the tech conversation that we seem to be having around the world, whether focused on innovation or addressing online harms, conversations around competition, or even broader human rights, we seem to have China in the center of the conversation. And in that context, differentiating China's stated strategies from China's actual approaches and policies from the impacts of the way that those Chinese strategies are operating in the world is essential to forming our own approaches to understanding and acting in the digital world. I couldn't be more pleased then to welcome today our esteemed guests as part of a double launch of two really important pieces of work on this very topic. We are joined today by our own resident fellow, Kenton Taibo, who recently launched the report called Chinese Discourse Power, Ambitions and Reality in the Digital Domain. We are also joined by Josh Chin, who is the Deputy Bureau Chief for China at the Wall Street Journal, and Liza Lin, who also reports the Wall Street Journal on tech and issues around China's approach. And they just released a really important and interesting book called Surveillance State: Inside China's Quest to Launch a New Era of Social Control. We will be having a wonderful conversation following this, moderated by Joanna Gao, who is the regional director for the Asia Pacific programs at the International Republican Institute, as well as serving as a non-resident senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council with the Global China Hub. I don't want to take up too much more time, but just to reiterate how lucky we are to have this combination of people here to illuminate for Josh and Liza a focus on understanding the way that China internally has organized itself on these issues, particularly focused on data collection and leveraging those tools both for control, but also for the functioning of efficiency and opportunity and innovation within the Chinese state, connected to the technological systems that we rely on here in the United States and around the world, as well as Kenton's work, which focuses on the outward efforts of how China leverages its interlocking strategies to advance its interests globally. So without further ado, I'm excited to pass to Joanna. Just first a note that we will have time for questions at the end, and just encourage everyone to follow along on our social media accounts, which is at DFR Lab on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, and anywhere else you could find us on the internet. So thank you, Joanna, for joining us. Thank you, Josh, Liza, and Kenton. Really excited to hear this conversation.
Thank you, Rose, for that introduction. Welcome to the panelists and welcome to everyone who's joining us live. So I'm going to just start off with some brief logistical details. As Rose mentioned, there will be an opportunity for questions. And so those of you in the audience, please feel free to address your questions to the panelists using the Q&A function, the chat, which should be to the right of your screens. This conversation is on the record, and we very much encourage you to engage with the discussion with the panelists on social media, and you will find the Twitter handles of everyone who is on here today also being posted on the chat there. And then last, if you have not already had a chance, the publications that we're talking about today are excellent. You will find links to them also that have been posted in the chat, and so very much encourage you to go and have a read of those if you haven't been able to already. So how we're going to sort of run the next hour is just have a bit of a guided conversation with the panelists, and then at the end we will open up to questions that will be coming up from the audience. And so want to really start off first with Josh and Liza. And in talking about your book, and really just jump right into it, because the book opens with this really wrenching description of the Uyghur poet, right, undergoing this sort of full biometric scan, right, and those details of how that happens is really quite something to read, and I was really struck, this description of this digital police state that's been created in Xinjiang versus the more benign, I guess, more positive sort of smart city that's described in elsewhere, in Hangzhou in particular, it sets up this quite dramatic juxtaposition, and so it was really interesting how this same set of tools can create either this dystopia or utopia, really depending on your perspective. So I really wanted to start at that big picture level and ask you really about the tensions in these tensions that the concept represents as they're outlined in your book. So over to you.
Sure, maybe I'll take that question. You actually highlighted a very important takeaway from our research for the book. Essentially, how state surveillance has two sides. It's two sides of the coin, and state surveillance can also be very sinister or nefarious, or it can be very attractive and alluring depending on who you are and where you are. Maybe for simplicity's sake, I'll start off with what the digital surveillance scene is like in Xinjiang, and then I'll start to contrast that with the smart cities you see in China. So in Xinjiang, if you were a Uyghur, the state surveillance is really not your friend. There are there are security camera networks installed all throughout the city. Many of them run facial recognition or image recognition to be able to recognize your face whenever you walk into a mosque for prayers, or whenever you cross a sidewalk, or if you walk into an internet cafe and meet your friends. And they also come with like image recognition. So you have things like license plate readers to track where you're going throughout the city. If you're a Uyghur in Xinjiang, chances are you have face prints and your voice prints recorded by the police. Essentially, the police will bring you down to the police station and they would ask you to record your voice, just read off from the day's like newspaper, read off a paragraph, and they'll record your voice prints. That way you'll have your gait, often also your gait, the way you walk, also recognized by the police, and many have had their DNA collected. So state surveillance there is very sinister and very menacing. And anytime you're identified as a person of interest by the police, the camera systems and the facial recognition will be able to pinpoint your location wherever you are in the city and find you very easily. And I'll contrast this with a smart city in China, in which the same computer vision algorithms and the same sort of security camera networks are doing a very different thing. For the Chinese, the bedrock of a smart city is typically a safe city. And when they refer to it as a safe city, they mean like cities where public order and public safety is all under control. So the same sort of systems that would recognize a person of interest in Xinjiang would be used and deployed to recognize fugitives on the run, for example, or other segments of the population that the Chinese police feel are a menace to society or a danger to national security. So that helps to keep criminals, drug smugglers, for example, people they view as potential terrorists off the street, people that residents generally don't want walking next to them, when they're in a city. So, and it's not just public safety. The same sort of camera systems, the same algorithms are used to spot flooding in periods of like heavy rain so that they can send a first responder or city officer down there to clear the scene, or to spot fires in areas where that might not be heavily populated, just to limit the damage very quickly. They've also been used in optimizing traffic, for example, used to identify the amount of traffic on the street to keep like green lights, the traffic lights green for longer, or to spot a traffic accident so that an ambulance and the traffic police can go quickly to clear the scene. So there's been a lot of the same systems and networks and algorithms used, but in a very different way outside of Xinjiang, in wealthier Chinese cities that are predominantly Han Chinese. And the last example I'll probably point to is just the use of facial recognition itself. In Xinjiang, the use of facial recognition is scary, and you fear it all the time, because who knows when you're flagged as a wanted person, and who knows when you're flagged as a wanted person according to the party's definitions. And you might be just hauled in for something really innocuous, like going to the mosque to pray too frequently, or having internet or digital versions of the Quran on your phone. So in Xinjiang, facial recognition is really feared, but in a place like Shanghai or Beijing or Shenzhen, the biggest cities in China, facial recognition is used to make everyone's life very frictionless. You can pay with your face. You can buy a subway ticket with your face. You can use your face as ID and enter the office without even scanning like a card. So there's just very contrasting uses that illustrate the two different sides of state surveillance in China.
And so, Kenton, I actually sort of wanted to bring you in here of sort of the extent to which what Liza was just describing of, you know, the sort of the two sides of this coin, how that corresponds with your own research, and the way that China's really articulated its ambitions in the digital domain.
Sure. So Chinese official and academic writings show that the CCP has really come to see the digital arena as crucial in what we kind of describe as its discourse power strategy. So discourse power refers to an ability to China's view of getting a narrative agenda setting ability to basically use norms and values to shape the international system in a way that's more amenable to its expression of power. And as one Chinese government official wrote in 2020, they see the digital arena as really offering an opportunity to gain a first mover advantage in kind of this discourse power space. This is because it's the fourth industrial revolution. Technological changes are occurring, which they see as bringing about economic changes, which also bring about changes in global power structure. And so they really see, in terms of its external strategy, which kind of complements its internal strategy, this digital arena as a real way that they can make very quick, strides in kind of gaining buy-in and operationalizing its aims to create an alternative global order. And the way it does this is, for example, promoting different norms, for example, its cyber sovereignty norm, and also by seeking to kind of gain control over digital and information spaces. And so in this way, for example, it sought to gain discourse power in the digital domain by, for example, shaping these local information ecosystems via digital and social media platforms and promoting CCP-approved norms for digital governance in China's developed international technical standards, and also by offering the physical, digital, and internet infrastructure on which these information ecosystems rely. And they do so at an affordable cost and with no conditions for really how it's used. And to this end, China also sees the global South as potentially more receptive to its norms and governance principles, and as an attractive market for Chinese digital infrastructure offerings. And also China's external propaganda narratives here really couch Beijing's activities in the digital sphere as ultimately aimed at granting countries more power over the development and direction of their digital economies. And this is where it kind of gets to Liza's original point about this kind of double-edged sword. China's strategy is less really about a true attempt to make the digital world more inclusive and more about supporting China's global ambitions, while boosting its economic growth and protecting its ability to exert political control domestically are two major goals of China's promotion of norms like cyber sovereignty. Beijing sees laying the necessary groundwork for gaining a discourse power advantage over the West as another key objective. And so in the global South, for example, China kind of seeks to promote these norms like cyber sovereignty, and kind of couches it in, presenting countries with the opportunity to determine their digital futures. But really, it's more about seeking to kind of shape the external environment in a way that helps to secure its own internal security, ensure its own internal security, which is really the political security of the CCP. And in this way, it's, the internal and external security really are kind of mutually constitutive.
Thank you. And I mean, I think on that question of security, I actually sort of want to hone in a little bit on Xinjiang with Josh and Liza, because obviously the use of these tools in Xinjiang has gained a lot of attention over the last several months. And so, I guess the question to you both is, how should we be looking at Xinjiang in terms of China's broader ambitions, right? Do we see this as a testing ground for, the sort of what you described as the sinister side of the sword, right? Is it a testing ground for what China wants to roll out more broadly, or is Xinjiang just different? Josh, you're muted, sorry.
Sorry about that. 3 years into the pandemic, I still haven't figured out the mute button. No, that is a question that we actually wrestled with throughout the book, even before we started writing it, because we had done reporting on Xinjiang very early on in 2017 when all this was starting to first come to light. And, in 2017, I remember coming back from Xinjiang from a first trip, and no one had really been reporting much there at that point. And I was talking to a human rights activist and just describing what I'd seen there, just absolutely suffocating levels of surveillance and this tracking of everyone and categorizing people according to the level of threat that they pose to the party and that sort of thing. It just seemed so just unreal, actually. And I was talking to this human rights activist about it, and he was like, "Oh, he's just watched. Xinjiang is like what's happening in Xinjiang now is going to be rolled out in China later." And I remember thinking, I was like, this guy's probably just, he's a human rights activist. He probably just has a really cynical view of the party, and it just doesn't seem possible that this is the sort of thing that would happen on a broad scale in China, partly because it's just so intensive, right? I mean, it's literally tracking everyone. And for a long time, you would sort of see little pieces and bits and pieces of Xinjiang kind of creeping out into other parts of China, especially where there are other Muslim populations. But for the most part, the way that the police used digital surveillance in Han Chinese dominated parts of the country was much more targeted, right? They had a list of, I think it's 7 types of people, right? And Liza's already sort of talked about some of them, drug traffickers, ex-cons, human rights activists, the mentally ill, and a few other categories of people who they felt like needed to be tracked. And so those people were subjected to, real-time constant surveillance and analysis and that sort of thing. But it was relatively limited, at least in terms of like hard surveillance, right? But what's changed, I think, recently is the pandemic. And when COVID-19 hit, what you saw was, it was really striking. I remember actually waking up one morning in February in Beijing when I still lived there, and coming down and seeing my entire apartment complex being closed off so that there was only one entrance in and out, so that they could track where people were going as a COVID control measure. And that is exactly what they had done in Xinjiang to Uyghur residential neighborhoods. And it was just like, it was really stunning to me. And then, over the next few months, you saw more of that, right? You saw that they rolled out, drones and other sorts of tracking tech to make sure people were staying inside. And then they eventually pushed out this health code system, which is on everybody's smartphone. So now everyone in China is digitally tracked in real time, constantly based on their exposure. And in Xinjiang, the Communist Party talks about religious extremism as an ideological virus, but so the rest of the country, it's a real virus, right? But they're using the exact same methods, but they're doing it on a national scale. Like basically all 1.4 billion people in China are being tracked the way Uyghurs were being tracked in 2017 and 2018. So they definitely are using the Xinjiang model now actively.
Sorry, Liza, were you going to add something there, or Liza? Sorry. So as you were looking very intensively, Josh and Liza, you were looking inside China. But I did want to sort of pull the lens out a little bit again, because I'm interested to get your take on what you think the relationship is between sort of China's internal strategies here and how it relates to its external strategies, some of the things that Kenton started to touch on.
Yeah, so Kenton actually very rightly pointed out China's internal and external digital strategies. Externally, it's really trying to create a safe space to be accepted within the world order because, as she pointed out, China feels like it's threatened because it's operating in an international norm that really favors the West and their side of their viewpoints versus like China's viewpoints. So in that respect, I was just thinking as she was talking earlier that the Chinese surveillance state is the perfect vehicle to blend China's internal and external digital strategies. And I say that because, let's just talk about the exports of these systems overseas. At the last count in 2020, there was a researcher from the University of Texas, and she found that China-made surveillance systems have found its way to 80 countries across the world. They're essentially in every continent except Australia and Antarctica. This has dual benefits for the Chinese government and the Chinese party. Firstly, every time a surveillance system is sold elsewhere, particularly in a democracy, it's an opportunity for the Chinese party to validate its own governance model for its own citizens, or validate its ability to innovate in the tech space, for example. Because you would always see state media play up such incidents and say, this is an example, so X and Y country basically adopted our surveillance system, safe city model, and this is an example of how Chinese people can innovate and Chinese people can contribute to the governance models out there. And the second benefit of that, which really blends this internal and external strategy, is it doesn't just validate the strategy at home, it also makes the world a safer place for Chinese-made systems and the Chinese-made idea of data sovereignty and cyber sovereignty when another country uses it, because it essentially means that they're not alone in pursuing this model. And the reason why I also say that is because a Chinese surveillance state is built on the ideas of data sovereignty, like an idea that China has been pushing forever. The idea that the state has access to all of this personal data. And I guess that's how I see the way surveillance systems, Chinese-made surveillance systems, play into the internal and external discourse.
I mean, in Kenton, that notion of cyber sovereignty was very much part of your report. And so I'm interested your thoughts on sort of expanding on what Liza was addressing there.
Yeah, very much agree with everything Liza said. I do think that, when we talk about China's export of these systems, I think at times in, the discourse, we kind of refer to it as exporting authoritarianism. And as Liza was saying, kind of getting to what some of the points she was making, I don't think this is quite the right framework for understanding China's goals on the international stage. And this relates to its ideas about, internal and external security. So this phrase, to me, this kind of exporting authoritarianism, connotes, to me, a type of authoritarian evangelism. And China's about China evangelism, China's model being superior, buying into the idea, as Liza was saying, that China is a responsible world leader, and not really about promoting a type of governance model, kind of how we think of Western democracy advocates doing. And in fact, China's pretty clear in emphasizing its agnosticism with regard to the domestic political characteristics of the governments with which it engages. There are really no requirements around governance, for example, when countries seek Chinese financing for projects. And to this end, it's less important to China whether countries support cyber sovereignty because it offers them more freedom in determining their digital futures, or whether governments really see this support for this approach as an opportunity to clamp down on internet freedoms. So getting back to kind of some of the themes we were talking about of, it depends on who's using this and, who is putting into place these systems, who's using it, and, the intentions behind that, the juxtaposition of Xinjiang and Hangzhou really kind of show that. So in either case, regardless of the intentions behind and how these are used, China gains discourse power by increasing buy-in for its vision of the global digital order, bringing it closer to achieving its aims of gaining a comparative advantage over the West in terms of both, reshaping kind of the institutional arrangements of the international order and also kind of the value arrangements of the international order, which China sees as being very much Western dominated, focusing on universal values, which come from, privileging civil liberties over, state concerns, and an institutional arrangement, which in their view seeks to kind of propagate US dominance by promoting things like, Western capitalism through organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. So while it's right and appropriate to focus on the implication of China's activities for its capacity to kind of empower autocratic impulses, China's aim really has less to do with changing countries internally and more to do with gaining this buy-in for its own model, with the goal of gaining support for, or at least mitigating opposition to its rise, which it sees as important for occupying its rightful place on the world stage. So really just kind of reiterating a lot of the themes that Josh and Liza have been saying.
And actually, to add to what Kenton said, sure. Just to add quickly to what Kenton said as well, one thing you don't see in the Chinese external facing discourse is how these surveillance systems have faced challenges overseas as well. So for example, a lot of these surveillance systems have been sold in the global south and to Africa in particular. And Africa just doesn't have the same sort of social and technological infrastructure and know-how as China does. So you would imagine a African country like Uganda or Ethiopia, or one of the recipients or buyers and customers of these surveillance systems, they don't have the same ID system that China has. So in China, you have ID card. Everyone has an ID card that has your face on it, where you stay, your ID number. So you can actually pinpoint a face to a particular person very quickly. In most African countries, their ID card system hasn't been established yet. So it really kind of it's one big challenge, one big reason why the surveillance system cannot be exported that easily from China. The other challenge obviously would be the fact that the algorithms that were being sold were trained on Chinese faces, or in some cases, ethnic minority cases in China. And it just doesn't work as well when it's put to use on a different sort of ethnicity and different sort of culture and population. So that makes these systems more prone to error overseas than they would be in China. And I think the last issue is really just the tech know-how. Chinese police have the technological know-how to, for example, operate these big systems, these back-end systems, the control room type of systems that you see with every sort of safe city or Chinese-style surveillance system. But that's not the case in every African or developing country that's buying such technology. Very often it boils down to the men and women in the uniform, and they can't operate these systems too. So that limits a lot of the effectiveness, and you don't hear that in the discourse coming out of China.
That is a good point. The limitations of sort of literally transplanting systems and technology to other countries. I do want to circle back though to one of the things that Kenton said. About this question of exporting authoritarianism. I think given this recent Freedom House report, for example, on sort of on China's this transnational repression. I'm curious, Kenton, you said earlier that China is agnostic about systems, but it's clearly not agnostic about sort of how it's being represented. And speaking earlier to your idea of sort of this control of the power to speak and control of the narrative, I sort of where do you see that piece of it playing into what you were describing earlier?
Right. So the idea of, China's, this relationship between China's internal and external strategies and how it relates to its efforts to seek discourse power, which we can describe as kind of the power to speak, which means the power to articulate a coherent vision of a world order. And also the power to be heard, which can be boiled down to the ability to gain buy-in for this vision based on how much it resonates with, a target audience. And so this all kind of relates back to China's conception of security in which the political security or continued rule of the CCP is paramount, and all other domains, including social, economic, and cyber, really play key supporting roles in ensuring this political security. There's internal security, which we kind of talked about, which Josh and Liza's book covers masterfully, which involves kind of controlling its own population, and then external security, in which China tries to create conditions outside of its borders to ensure that the international system is amenable to its priorities. And so as for discourse power, just kind of going back a bit, beginning in the 2000s, we see China's leadership coming to the belief that the political, economic, linguistic, technological, and cultural dominance of the US allowed it to gain discourse dominance over the international system, meaning it was able to structure the international system to its advantage, kind of talking about what we mentioned earlier in terms of both value orientation and institutional arrangements. And so from China's perspective, this current order both reinforces and serves as a tool for Western countries, and especially the US, to perpetuate its continued dominance. And so, this isn't really compatible with China's desires to step out and claim what it views as its rightful role in the international stage. And so in response to this deficit, Chinese scholars studied the example of the US and developed an understanding of discourse power as both this power to speak and this power to be heard. And so this kind of came to really, and again, this is all with the idea of the relationship between internal and external security kind of hovering over everything as a North Star. And so this idea of, how do we articulate both a vision of, this world order that we're saying, is, hey, this is our value proposition, in such a way as to, have it resonate. That's kind of driving, that kind of drives this external, like, digital strategy. And, in the digital domain, for example, the way this is kind of applied in the global South and in the digital domain is, Chinese messaging on digital cooperation emphasizes this shared distrust of Western governments, or a shared experience as, a quote unquote developing nation, to use China's terms. And, it'll often use regional platforms to deploy narratives that really resonate with local audiences, to gain the power to be heard, and to gain support for its own policy priorities. So, for example, China's put out statements from its meetings with regional organizations like, speaking about Africa, for the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, or FOCAC, all of which have really emphasized China's anti-imperial solidarity with developing countries and its shared history of exploitation. And during these engagements, China kind of leverages this messaging, emphasizing that countries should be, distrustful of a Western-centered internet in which companies like, Google and Meta may colonize their digital spaces to offer their own cyber sovereignty friendly products. And this messaging resonates for a reason. It really taps into a lot of the very legitimate grievances that countries in the global South have about how the current economic system is structured. And so but to kind of get to Liza's points too, these systems that are given are kind of prone to error in these environments, but that doesn't really matter as much to China, as because it gives China access to better data. In Zimbabwe, for example, they're rolling out these biometric systems, and in turn China is able to gain access to the data that will allow it to train its algorithms, its facial recognition software and hardware, to be able to recognize different kinds of faces, African faces, that kind of allow it to become more and more, accurate, and allow it to more and more be able to exert, more full control internally. So this is kind of this is kind of how all of this ecosystem kind of relates to each other and feeds back, internal and external security kind of feed on each other, and all work towards the North Star, strengthening China's control.
So we've talked quite a bit. This idea of security has come up quite a bit, and very related to this, I think, is this notion of privacy. And it's clearly, whenever we're talking about anything in the digital realm, concerns about privacy come up very quickly. And so for Josh and Liza, you know, I'm actually really curious in terms of what, as you were doing the research and writing the book, what you found, what was the role of privacy, right? Both in a legal sense and also in a social sense, in the ability of China to expand its surveillance state.
Josh, do you want to take this?
I'll take that. I'll unmuting again. Yeah, no, privacy was one of these topics that sort of was kind of a huge pain for us, frankly, as we were writing the book, because it morphed over time. All right, and I think when we started the reporting on this, you know, there was this sense, which I think was generally true in China, that most people, you know, most people in China didn't spend a ton of time speaking, you know, thinking about privacy. It just wasn't a priority for them, and that, you know, that really began to shift in some fairly dramatic ways. And the one example from our book that we have is, you know, one person we write about is this artist named Xu Bing, who is a visual artist, works in a lot of different mediums. But one of the things he wanted to do at one point was to try to make a fictional film using real surveillance footage. And you know, for the longest time he couldn't do it because it was just so hard to get that footage. And you know, he had friends in police departments who were giving it to him and stuff like that, but it still wasn't enough to actually make a film. And then I think it was in 2015 or 2016, he stumbled on these websites that were that have been established by Chinese home security companies that sold like home internet connected surveillance cameras or security cameras, right? Where you could, and the idea was that you could log into this website and remotely view your own home security camera, right? Even if you weren't at home. But the Chinese, you know, which is common around the world, but what the Chinese companies had done was make, some of them made the default setting public, right? So that anyone could see the footage from your security camera. And so they had, it was amazing to go on these sites and just see this. There were scenes from like every city in China and people's homes and stores and that sort of thing. And so, and this seemed like one of those examples of like exactly how little Chinese people care about surveillance. I mean, they were actually using it as entertainment in some cases, right? And so he, you know, Xu Bing downloaded all this footage, thousands and thousands of hours of it, and made a fictional film. And just as he was taking it on the film festival circuit, this controversy started brewing online with this a young Chinese woman had stumbled onto these sites and been really like appalled by them, especially because, you know, some of these cameras were like trained on like yoga studios or like, you know, places that were sort of intimate, and was showing like, and it wasn't always clear that people knew they were being filmed, right? Or like sometimes there were children being filmed, probably without their consent. And so she wrote this big long blog post and addressed it to one of the CEOs of these companies, and it just blew up, became this massive thing, and people started piling on, and eventually all of those platforms got shut down, right? So this story that we thought was an example of just how little Chinese people care about privacy actually turned into the exact opposite. And so, you know, it's a difficult concept to sort of understand. I mean, anywhere, but particularly in China, because it's hard to know exactly how much people care and in what ways. I mean, most of the privacy concern is in the cities, you know, in like wealthier cities with more educated populations, some people who studied in the West, and you know, but there is, you know, though amongst those people, privacy is a thing. And, you know, the Communist Party has done a really interesting thing with privacy, which is instead of crushing the discussion of privacy, they've essentially tried to channel it towards private companies, right, and away from the government. And so you now often see privacy, you know, privacy related outrage sort of targeting companies like Alibaba or the search engine Baidu, that sort of thing, but not as much the government. And more recently, the government even went so far as that they passed a personal information protection law, which is actually on its face one of the strictest data privacy regulations globally, in terms of what it requires, in terms of the regulations and hurdles to collecting data. But it has some really important loopholes for the government, particularly when it comes to state security, right? So the Chinese government itself is not really restrained by the law. at least not ultimately restrained by the law, but they are able to restrain other access, other uses of data. So now essentially the government has they've really strengthened their own hold on data.
Yeah, and actually,
sorry, go ahead.
could I
add
to that? Could I add to that quickly? Privacy is one aspect that supports the rollout of the surveillance state in China, but it would not be possible without supporting legislation or supporting technological infrastructure. And by that, I mean, from 2015 or so, China started rolling out a suite of really vague and draconian laws, like the national intelligence law, the cybersecurity law, essentially mandating that data has to stay in China, and it gives the state, particularly state security agencies, the right to demand data from companies and individuals and entities in the name of national security. And national security is a very broadly defined term in China. It can go anything from like terrorists to like a human rights activist that China feels might be disturbing like social order. So it's not just the concept of privacy awareness that's allowed the surveillance state to thrive. It's also, the suite of new laws that they've introduced. And finally, the great Chinese internet firewall, right? That's allowed the Chinese party to block out any sort of critique of that system by blocking out many Western media websites. So a lot of Chinese actually don't know the flaws and the failings and the more sinister side of state surveillance. So that's really, all these three variables working in conjunction with each other has enabled the rise of this.
No, thank you for that, because I think it is, you're right. It's interesting how these things all play off each other, and also certainly in work we've seen around the world, this question of national security does become this sort of is something that can be expanded or contracted depending on how it needs to be applied. I wanted to just touch on one other sort of thing that we hear about a lot, or we've read about a lot. This whole idea of the social credit system, right, is something that you touch on quite a bit in the book. Can you just expand on how this works in China in theory, but also in practice, and maybe touch on some of, I think, the misconceptions that we have in the West about what it is and why it exists?
So social credit is probably is by far the most well-known aspect of state surveillance in China. It's the one thing that if you talk about surveillance in China, people will say, "Oh, social credit, I've heard of that." It's also by far the most misunderstood aspect of state surveillance in China. I think that's you can kind of trace it back to a bit of confusion early on when it was first announced. When it came out it sort of emerged in 2015. And initially, what it was is this, it's a system that aims to examine creditworthiness or sincerity or reliability in sort of Chinese organizations, companies, and also as individuals across a huge swath, right? So it sort of takes the idea of financial credit scoring or credit rating or evaluation and expands it, into other areas that aren't typically considered, like they would be, like by FICO in the US, for example. And early on, what happened was a lot of the early Western media reports sort of conflated China's system with similar efforts that were being run by Chinese companies, in particular Alibaba. And Alibaba had developed this thing called Sesame Credit, which was a system that it used to rate its own customers, and it used all kinds of data of its own data, based on what people were buying and when like what time of night they were buying it or daytime or what phone they used and that sort of thing. And they were trying to use that data to create these sort of digital dossiers on their users and try to infer conclusions about their reliability, right? And so people kind of conflated the Chinese system with the government system with the commercial system, and then of course I think got a little bit carried away and talking about how this was, everyone was going to have a single rating for everything they did in life, right? And that was, and they were going to walk around in this kind of Black Mirror like dystopian reality with everyone's got a number that you can look up. The reality is a little bit messier. I think the ambition is definitely there for the government system. I mean, we talked to one of the government advisors who was tapped really early on to build China's credit system in the early 2000s. And he said that the system did evolve over time, and it does really have this ambition of being a mechanism for judging people across a huge, vast swath of behaviors. But there are a lot of technical barriers, right? So this idea that people are being scored, it's really hard to actually develop a single score for everything. And so you have experiments that are happening at the local level. Some cities are trying to implement scores, but others have realized that's actually not very helpful. One of the main enforcement mechanisms for bad behavior is the blacklist, and this is actually tied to the legal system. So if you, for example, have a court judgment against you and you fail to pay it, you'll end up not just on the court's blacklist, but you might end up on an airline blacklist or the railway blacklist or hotel blacklist. So you can't take a high-speed train, right, or book a luxury hotel. So the idea is that if you misbehave in one area, you can be punished for that in other areas. And so they are trying to do that. But what's really, I think, actually really interesting about social credit and really revealing about it is the ways it doesn't work, right? And it is because it's this really fragmented system. The data that you need to sort of rate people is spread all over the place and controlled by different people and stored on different systems. The algorithms you would need to sort of pull all that together don't really exist yet, or not very good. And so it's actually kind of not a great system, at least for individuals, for rating individuals. But the state media for a long time was pumping it up and talking about it like it was this sort of magical rating system. And it was, and it became, I think, as we looked into it, as an example of how surveillance in China is actually as much a propaganda project as a technological one, right? And the idea is to persuade people that they are being watched and tracked and rated all of the time, even if they're not. And if you can sort of plausibly, if you have enough examples where you punish enough people that people, the general populace believes they're being tracked, then that's sort of all you really need to do, or that's the majority of what you want to accomplish as the Communist Party.
So I have one last question for all three of you, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. And so really, it's just from the perspectives of the research that you all have done, what's coming, right? What's coming next? What do you see happening over the next few years? I guess sort of part of that being, what do you think is realistic or probable of what what you've seen, what China has said their goals are? What do you see actually coming to pass in the near future? Kenton, do you want to take that first?
Sure. Like many, I'm looking to see what comes out of the upcoming National Party Congress in October. Not expecting any big surprises, but still expecting Xi to further kind of diminish the deliberative role of government ministries in favor of kind of this more informal style of policymaking. I think Asia society once described Xi as a man willing to make big bets. So I'm kind of waiting to see what comes out of October 16th. All signs really point to continued consolidation of power, and China has these clear goals beyond 2022 for its status on the world stage and for its aims to rule the global digital ecosystem. For example, China's announced it aims to dominate advanced technology manufacturing by 2025, to lead in international standards by 2035, and to become a cyber superpower by 2050. So I'd imagine further efforts to kind of tweak institutions and processes, internally to achieve those goals, and then kind of seeing more of a consolidation of political will and resources externally to really push on those goals. Also, I think we talked a little bit about the reason why the report is called, ambitions and realities is that there are differences between China's stated goals and China's ambitions, which are seem very sweeping and broad and kind of monolithic, and then the realities on the ground. And I think Josh and Liza's book really really show that. And I think on the one hand, we shouldn't get we shouldn't think that, just because China has these aims and says these goals that it's a, fait accompli. At the same time, the ambition is there, the intention is there. And so, it's imperative to kind of take seriously these goals and ambitions, and to kind of develop an understanding of how China, sees itself, not just now, but in the future, in these domains, and to really kind of use that as a way to think about, where do democratic countries stand? What does a democratic approach to all of this look like?
Thanks, Kenton. Josh and Liza, what's coming from your perspective?
Sure, I will probably speak about the perspective of China's surveillance state and its development. So I think the Chinese surveillance state is only going to get more sophisticated and better at what it's doing. So we've already seen camera counts reach almost about 400 million in China. So I don't think we'll see a spread. It wouldn't be a big jump in the number of camera counts. So I think the sophistication will come in terms of smarter cameras, better algorithms that can recognize faces better, or better predictive policing sort of systems that will be coming out. And I say that because if you look at some of the patent data that's coming out, if you look at China's computer vision patents for last year, 50% of those patents were directed towards like law and order and kind of used for policing. So with so many patents coming up, basically with the same sort of iteration that you see with Chinese internet companies, the Chinese surveillance data is only going to get better. And we also know that China has been trying to clean up or I guess mitigate some of the loopholes and the challenges facing its surveillance system. One of these challenges is the formation of data islands. So right now you have many surveillance cameras, but a lot of these surveillance cameras don't talk to each other, or the data is not centralized in one database. It's often like spread out across multiple databases. What China has correctly identified as a problem are these data islands, and they're moving very quickly to fix it. So I just feel like going forward, we're going to see much more efficient and accurate identification and sort of predictive policing software.
Right. I think, I think Liza captured exactly where China is headed. I think one of the things that when we're looking to the future that I'm curious about is how democratic countries are going to respond to what China's doing. I think, Kenton and Liza are both absolutely correct that there's a huge difference between ambition and reality in terms of China exporting this, and this idea of China exporting authoritarianism is sort of problematic, but China does have these ambitions, right? And it has a really simple message that I think appeals to a lot of countries, including countries that are sort of teetering between democracy and authoritarianism, and that is that these technologies can be used to exert a tremendous amount of social control, and there are real examples of that. And Uganda is one place that we went to where the leader there, Yoweri Museveni, did use a Chinese state surveillance system bought from Huawei. He didn't use it in the same sophisticated way that China does, but he did successfully use it in the latest elections to really bottle up the opposition and win an election when a lot of people thought that he might lose it. So anyway, I think China offers this really simple message, and democracies sort of haven't yet come up with their own alternative to that. And I think that's, there are efforts to do that. The EU right now has a draft law on AI that includes a provision that would ban real-time use of surveillance by law enforcement. So they're sort of staking out one extreme end of things. The UK is a little bit more in the middle. They have a lot of surveillance cameras, as anyone who's been to London knows. But those cameras are regulated. They have an independent agency that regulates how those cameras are used, and there's a code of conduct and that sort of thing. Whereas in the US, we're all like, the US is very schizophrenic, state to state. It's extremely, the rules vary. New York City the NYPD uses a ton of surveillance. It's really amazing just how much they've embraced sort of almost Chinese style uses of this technology, whereas California has tried to implement a bunch of different bans. But I think I think, or I hope, the future is one in which, particularly in the U.S., this becomes a real, the government uses of technology, and how those can be made compatible with democracy becomes a real topic for discussion.
Thank you for that. And that actually sort of responds to one of the questions that came up from the audience. And it really strikes me, based on what you're saying, Josh, part of the beginning of a democratic response really is in transparency, right? And sort of trying to shed light on the decisions that are being made. Wanted to go to a second question that has been posted from the audience, in which, there was this discussion about the domestic conversation in China on privacy. And so the question is to Kenton, in your research, how has the proliferation of Chinese tech in the global South influenced conversations around privacy, labor, or ownership? And how is it shaping the conversation in other parts of the world? Kenton, over to you.
Yeah, so I'm actually working on a second report in this series that kind of addresses this. But what in my research, what I've seen is kind of a positive feedback loop of, people to people diplomacy in the global South, China's drive to shape international technical standards and international bodies, the compatibility of the standards that they push with Chinese domestic technologies, and the adoption of these standards in the global South, and then the marketing of China's technologies and know-how through people-to-people exchanges with partners in the global South. And this also influences shaping of local governance policies, where this technology resides, that nod closely to China's cyber sovereignty norm. And then China leverages its deep media relationships in a lot of these contexts to kind of flood local media environments with stories of the benefits of China's investment in developing countries' digital futures. So there's this kind of, I'll just give an example. China's very active in international standard setting bodies, especially the ITU. A lot of the standards that they really push for international standards are just basically adapted to domestic technological standards, for example, for facial recognition technologies. And this is particularly important to countries in the global South because a lot of them really adopt standards developed by the ITU. And so there's this kind of positive feedback loop where China markets these technologies as solutions to real problems, where internationally you have, standards that are kind of adhere to these technologies. And then China has really been influencing these countries to help develop, policies that govern them. And this comes in the form of, helping to shape laws based on their own, cybersecurity laws, their intelligence laws. We see countries like, Vietnam, who have received training from Chinese companies, kind of importing also a lot of the, policy and governance frameworks for governing these technologies. So there is this kind of positive feedback loop that connects all of this stuff together in a bigger ecosystem.
Thank you for that. And then last question I have has come in for Josh and Liza, which is, in the reporting that you were doing, did anything surprise you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say probably the biggest surprise, which gets to a point we've touched on a little bit, is when we started out doing this reporting, I've been a reporter at that point. I've been a reporter in China for more than a decade, and Liza had also a lot of experience. And I think both of us, we knew that when you start reporting on sensitive stories, you get a little bit of pushback. You might get detained. Your sources might be harassed, that sort of thing. At least in the early stages of this, before all the Xinjiang reporting came out, the government was like weirdly not that bothered by it. And I mean, companies were happy to talk about it. And even, some police officers were willing to chat with us about how they did things. And then state media was promoting actually very similar stories to the ones we were doing about facial recognition and the uses of it for sort of managing society. And it was just really bizarre. At first we're like, oh, what's going on? And then I think so it sort of dawned on us that actually, the Communist Party really likes or wants to promote this idea of itself as all-seeing. And it sort of gets to our discussion on social credit, right, where they're trying to promote this idea of themselves as omnipotent, even if they actually aren't. And that was, I think that was, for us, that was one of the really big surprises, at least early on.
Yeah, and I guess to add to what Josh said as well, I think another big revelation came when we were at an Interpol conference, which was we were at an Interpol conference as part of our reporting, and I happened to meet a researcher from a Chinese public security university, and I asked him about the surveillance system, and I said, there are all these privacy implications, possible abuse of technology. Why are you still doing this? And he basically said, you Western media, you're getting it all wrong. The reason why we're doing this is because Chinese media, we're fundamentally under-resourced versus other countries. So, for example, like in China, you have one policeman to kind of oversee 700 citizens. In the US and the UK, the ratio is a lot lower. In the US, the ratio is 1 to 400. In the UK is 1 to 440. That's why Chinese police they're just so embracing of such technology, because they see the internet as a way to overcome that divide, to get over the fact that they're under-resourced. So I think that was another striking point during our research.
Interesting from all of you. Thank you. We are at time, so we will bring this session to a close. I would really like to thank Josh and Liza and Kenton for their sort of contributions on the panel today. Thank you all for joining us. And as we said at the beginning, all of the publications are linked in the chat, as well as everyone's social media handles. So please feel free to interact with them there. Thank you all. See you all again soon.